Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome from me, Ian Craig, in sunny Scotland, I have to say, which is an unusual thing, so I have to add that in. We're really pleased to have, welcome back, Professor Mike Gleeson. Mike, you joined us 2 years ago. It's already been that time. And Mike is going to talk football again. Last time it was football when he was talking about the UEFA position statement. Mike has now retired from Loughborough University, but you wouldn't know he'd retired because he's written prolifically over the last couple of years. And you featured your recent book, Eat, Move, Sleep, Repeat. Is that correct?
Yes, that's one of them, yes.
That's one of his books. He's got a new one that we're about to introduce you to as well, which is out later this year, which is on football. So Mike, his specialism was exercise immunology, and that's a big interest of mine. So that basically caught my attention. And we've been in contact for a few years now, and he's kindly lectured for me. And I really enjoy the content that Mike has to share. So I'm just going to, oh, Mike, you've got control of the slides. If you can just go on to slide 2, please.
Sure.
So we've got the lineup for this evening. I'm just about to hand over to Mike, who will present up to about 45 minutes. I will then just do a quick announcement of the new conference that we are hosting in 2 weeks' time. And then we'll go back to Mike for the last 10, 15 minutes of Q&A. With regard to Q&A, please type in questions as you think about them in the chat box. And I will gather the best ones to fire at Mike. If there's any that are really good as he's talking, I might interrupt him and ask him then. And just to get you warmed up with the chat box, please can you type in where you're from and what you do and what you'd like to learn from tonight. Okay, right, over to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. That's what I'm talking about tonight, a holistic view of nutrition for professional and amateur footballers. And by holistic, I mean a fairly comprehensive view of the roles of nutrition for playing football, because it's not just about competition or match day performance, although most things are related to that. There are many wider aspects of nutrition that are important for, training adaptation, for recovery, for the overall health of the player as well. And I've taken a lot of the graphics today that you'll see in this talk from the book I've just finished writing. In fact, it's in production now, should be out in time for Christmas, called Nutrition for Top Performance in Football. So look out for that when it comes in the shops or appears on Amazon sometime in the autumn. So this is a brief summary of what I'll talk about today. I'll cover the reasons why nutrition is thought to be very important in football, why that's increased over the years compared to, say, 30 years ago, when it wasn't probably even considered as being something to think about. We'll look at the training and competition demands of football, because that informs what the nutritional requirements are. The match day and training day nutrition that's recommended for the pros, and that's based largely on the UEFA expert group statement on nutrition in elite football, which was published last year in the British Journal of Sport Nutrition. That, together with recovery nutrition, which is also covered extensively in that paper. And something that wasn't really covered that much at all was some special considerations for the amateur player, because there are differences between the amateurs and the players, not only in the amount of hours they spend in training, but also the timing of training sessions. For the pros, it's in the morning. For the amateurs, it tends to be midweek evenings. And then the timing of actual match play, which usually is from lunchtime onwards for the professionals, including evening games. For most amateurs, particularly at lower levels, it's sort of a 10 o'clock Sunday morning kickoff. So there are differences there in what we can advise on the nutrition side. And also finish why nutrition guidelines need to be actually personalised to the needs of the individual. There's no one-size-fits-all diet for a football player. So what the football players really want to be able to do, they want to be able to win games, perform well in competitions, maintain a consistent high level of performance over the course of a season. For that, they need to be able to train well and effectively. They need to be able to recover quickly from hard training sessions and from match play. At the end of the day, they also want to avoid burnout. They want to remain healthy and avoid injury. In other words, they want to remain available for selection for the manager. And that's very important also in the manager's mind. And the point here is that a good diet and appropriate food and fluid intake at the right times can help all of these things. This is what was covered in the UEFA expert group statement on nutrition in elite football. You can see there were lots of different things, in fact, 9 sort of total topics within the paper, including match day nutrition and training nutrition, body composition. These were covered for both male and female players at the elite level. And other things that were considered were environment and travel issues, culture, religious, social issues, the issue of dietary supplements, whether or not to take them and which ones are effective for football and which ones aren't, nutrition for rehabilitation to speed recovery from injury, and then also the needs of the referees and the linespeople and the junior high-level players in the academies. So what I'm talking about today is largely based on this evidence. I'm not going to present a huge amount of science or data from papers, a few, but not a lot. It's mostly the advice that comes from this and try and translate it for people who are actually working in football or just interested in the subject. And a good place to start is, with the views of an expert, experienced, long-standing manager. And here we have a quote from Arsene Wenger, who was actually tasked with writing a sort of a foreword or prologue to that expert group statement paper. And he says the goal of any elite team is performance. Yeah, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? They want to win as many matches as possible. But there's lots of factors involved, technical, tactical, mental, physical qualities of the players. But he says, one area that he's advocated for many, many years, actually going back to the 1980s, he was one of the first managers to recognize the importance of nutrition in football. And he says, one of the things that helps achieve those performance goals is nutrition. It's grown in its importance over the years. So when I said holistic at the start, and said it's a comprehensive understanding of how nutrition influences ultimately competition performance, there's many factors involved, even on the nutrition side. So we've got, competition performance, match day performance, if you like, but we've also got issues of nutrition that affect recovery, the ability to adapt to the training stimulus, influence body composition, that influence the risk of injury, the speed of rehabilitation from injury. Nutrition is food, but it's also what we drink, and the water in food and what we drink contributes to our hydration status, which is important to get right at the start of a football match. It affects our cognitive mental function. It affects immune function and susceptibility to infection. It affects how well we sleep. It affects our overall health. And of course, it's used for fueling up after training sessions and after competition to be ready for the next training session or competition, whatever comes first. So lots of different ways in which nutrition actually affects performance directly or indirectly. It's also, I think, a good idea to think in terms of what's the boss most interested in? And the boss at most clubs is the football manager or head coach. And again, this is the view of Arsene Wenger's but he picks out 4 things to ensure that the players are in the best physical condition, have optimal level of body fat and muscle mass. So it's about body composition and the ability to do hard training. To make sure that the players are fueled and have the energy to sustain the intensity for at least 90 minutes. So about fueling for endurance during a match. And then to accelerate the players' recovery afterwards from the previous match and from intensive training sessions, so they're ready to carry on in the next day or 2. And also to support overall health as part of a balanced lifestyle, both inside the ground, which where the clubs can have control because they're feeding the players in these training ground canteens or restaurants, which are actually more akin to a high-end restaurant nowadays, and outside the club environment, where often the newly introduced performance chef comes into play. If we look at what a football match actually involves, so those who are actually playing the full 90 minutes, these are some sort of typical average and range values for some of the things that are important within the match. You can see the number of jumps, tackles, passes, sprints on average, the sprinting distance, high intensity actions, 170 of those, total distance covered nearly 11 kilometers, around about 7 miles, and about 10% of that covered in high intensity running. So it's a high intensity intermittent activity. The average intensity, if we average it over the 90 minutes, is about 70% of aerobic capacity or maximal oxygen uptake. In total, a player will expend an additional 1,600 calories playing a 90-minute match, and something like 60 to 70% of the energy, because it's high intensity, is coming from carbohydrate oxidation and anaerobic glycolysis. So these are the fuel sources that a player will use during a match. It's got its carbohydrate stores as muscle glycogen and liver glycogen. About 300 grams of glycogen are stored in the leg muscles, and about 100 grams of glycogen in the liver. In the liver, that can be broken down into glucose released into the blood, which is used by both the muscle and the brain. The muscle glycogen is exclusively used by the muscle. And then in lower intensity activities, the predominant fuel will be fat, and we've got plenty of that even in relatively slim football players. So that's not an issue in terms of the amount of energy available, but it can only fuel exercise at sort of moderate level intensities of exercise. For the high level stuff, high intensity stuff, we need carbohydrate. And also for the really all-out sprints and jumping, we need phosphocreatine, the high energy store that can be very rapidly converted into ATP for energy. So those are the fuels that are used. The problem, of course, with the carbohydrate stores is that we have limited amounts of those in the body, and it's important for a player to maximize those before they start a match. So again, you've got this 100 grams or so in the liver when it's fully loaded. You can get about 300 grams of glycogen in the muscles. Here I'm referring specifically to the leg muscles because that's mostly what obviously football players will be using. And there's a small amount of glucose that's actually present in the blood and the extracellular fluids, but it's fairly negligible compared with the main stores of glycogen that we have, the polymer of glucose. And then in addition to that, you can take on board some additional carbohydrate. And players might do this as you see them sort of leaving the tunnel just before coming out onto the pitch, or maybe up to about 10 minutes before coming out onto the pitch. They can take on board a little bit more, perhaps at half time. They can take on some during breaks in play, but that glucose that's taken in the form of either sports drinks or gels, that's only delivered to the blood from the gut at a rate of about 1 gram per minute. So it's not making a huge contribution compared with the stores of glycogen that we have available. Now, one problem is that if you start your game with low glycogen stores, and this is an original study back from actually from the 1970s that showed if you start a game with low glycogen stores, that's in the red bars there, you're almost run out of glycogen by half time, and at the end of the game you're completely depleted compared to starting those with high glycogen in the blue. And if you see what that does to the distance run, it doesn't do much to first half performance, but in the second half, you're running about 20–30% less distance. And in fact, a high proportion of that less distance is also run at slower speeds. So there's a lot more walking, a lot less high intensity work in that as well. So basically, if you start with low glycogen, you're really going to impair your performance, particularly in the second half of a game. So it's best avoided. One of the problems with football compared to, say, cycling or just running on the flats, like running a 10K or a 10-mile race, is that after the game, when you've probably depleted your glycogen by at least sort of 60%, then it takes rather a long time to restore it. Now, a cyclist, after doing several hours of cycling, or a runner running 10 miles in a couple of hours or so, they'll restore their glycogen almost pretty fully within 24 hours. That doesn't happen in football. It doesn't happen in rugby either, and some of these other similar games where there is an element of muscle damage related to the sort of exercise that's done, some eccentric muscle actions that cause muscle damage and soreness. This seems to inhibit the rate at which glycogen is repleted after exercise, even if you go on a high carbohydrate diet. So in this example, even after essentially 2 days after the game, the glycogen stores, even on a high carbohydrate diet, have only been 70% restored. So that's a major issue when you've got another game, perhaps the day after that. So this is the main recommendations from the UEFA expert group statement about what you should eat on match day for the professionals. And perhaps actually a good point to make is that actually the day before the game is probably the most important for actually loading up those muscle glycogen stores. So you're recommended to take 6 to 8 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram body mass per day on that day before the game. And that should get your muscle glycogen stores up. On the day of the game, you've got very limited amount of time and opportunity for fueling before a game, and you won't get much carbohydrate or glycogen restoration in that phase, at least not in the muscle. But what you will be able to do is restore your liver glycogen stores, which will have been depleted overnight because your brain still uses glycogen or uses glucose that's derived from liver glycogen as a fuel throughout those hours when you're asleep. So when you wake up in the morning, your liver glycogen is depleted, you want to restore that. You can do that fairly quickly as long as you take on board plenty of carbohydrate in the morning or at lunch as well, if you have the opportunity to do so before, say, a 3 o'clock kickoff in the afternoon. You should also be well hydrated. There's recommendations for that there. Some players and some clubs advocate the use of ergogenic dietary aids, principally usually on match day. That might be beetroot or rhubarb shots, which contain dietary nitrate, which is known to improve endurance performance, and the use of caffeine at fairly low doses, usually taken about 1 hour before kickoff for optimal effect throughout a match. Overall, the energy expenditure on match day for a professional player is likely to be about 3,500 calories. And that needs to be matched by the intake on that day, partly before the game and then after the game has finished in recovery. Most players will also, you'll see them, I say, taking a gel or some sips of a sport drink, trying to get some carbohydrate on board just before kickoff. And then half time, there's another opportunity to ingest some carbohydrate. Usually 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate can be gotten in then. For players who don't want to have caffeine before or might think it might do them some better just to benefit the second half performance, they can take caffeine chewing gum, which is more rapidly absorbed than caffeine from powder or pills. But remember to spit out that gum before running onto the pitch. You can drink water, obviously, to avoid dehydration on warm days. And when opportunity arises, you can mouth rinse a sport drink with carbohydrate in it and then swallow it to get a little bit more carbohydrate on board when opportunity arises. And then you're into recovery after that, and I'll cover those details in the next in a few slides' time. So this is how sort of the amounts and timing of various things might work on match day for a 3 o'clock kickoff. With a 3 o'clock kickoff, we've got opportunity to take on board nutrition, both for like a breakfast and then essentially for sort of a lunchtime pre-match meal. And pre-match meals are recommended to be consumed something like somewhere between 3 and 4 hours before kickoff, so that everything that's been consumed kind of been digested and absorbed, and there's nothing left sitting in the stomach when the player goes onto the pitch, other than maybe a little bit of fluid that they can take on board just before kickoff. So then again, opportunities at half time, and then at full time again, we're back into the recovery issue where finger food snacks are often made available now in the changing rooms when the players come off, so they can have something straight away after they've finished, and then can have a proper meal a little later, often if it's an away game, traveling back on a coach or the train or whatever mode of transport they're using. Now, with some of these things, the timing of nutrient intake can be important. So if you take on board that immediate pre-match carbohydrate, sort of like I say, 5 to 10 minutes before you go out onto the pitch, then you get what you see in the blue line. That's what's happening to your blood glucose concentration. It'll be at its normal level between 4 and 5 millimoles per litre beforehand. You take that carbohydrate on board, it goes into your stomach, you start to slowly absorb it. The absorption is delayed because of the exercise you're doing. You don't get a large rise, it maintains it at slightly higher than normal level throughout the duration of the match, and that's what you want, really. If you take that same amount of carbohydrate, we're talking sort of 30, 40 grams of carbohydrate. If you take that 45 minutes before the game starts, which you might think is a good idea, get it on board early and get it in, it doesn't really work that way. You get a large rise in your blood glucose response, as shown in the red line there, but it's accompanied by a large increase in insulin secretion. And then when you start exercise, you've got that insulin driving glucose into the tissues, and then you have your muscle taking up more glucose from the blood. You can end up with this situation where the blood glucose level actually drops below normal for maybe 20 minutes or so into the game. It's a hypoglycemia that you don't really want. There's no real evidence it affects actual physical performance, but it potentially could affect mental performance. And the last thing the manager wants is a player switching off in those first 20 minutes of a game. So take your last shot of carbohydrate just before you go on the pitch. During a match, there are occasional breaks in play due to treatments for injuries, or nowadays for the referee going to look at a VAR decision on the monitor, and that gives players an opportunity to take on board some carbohydrate. And many have read about this carbohydrate rinsing phenomenon, which is shown to improve cognitive and physical performance just by actually taking carbohydrate into the mouth, rinsing it around for about 10 seconds and then spitting it out. And that actually just seemed to have an effect on performance. But in reality, you don't need to spit it out. In fact, you should actually swallow it. If you swallow it, you get the benefit going into the gut and then coming out into the blood, and that glucose is then available for the muscles as well as getting that effect on the brain. So you get a double whammy. So don't spit it out on the pitch, as was what people were doing or players were doing, it seemed only a year or two ago. And then we're on to recovery, and that's all about the 4 hours. Rest is one, and the other things are all to do with really related to nutrition, to rehydration, to refueling, and to helping those muscles repair from that damage that's been incurred during the match. So for recovery nutrition, this is the recommendations. As immediately post-match, there should be some sports drinks, gels made available to the players as they come off the pitch. There'll be finger food available in the dressing room, again, high carbohydrate stuff, and maybe also a recovery protein shake. There's a number of commercially available ones that contain a mixture of about 40 grams of protein, 50 grams of carbs, all in about 500 milliliters of fluid, so it's helping you rehydrate as well. And some of them contain creatine, which, as we'll see, could be an important factor as well. And that helps you to begin the process of muscle glycogen restoration and rehydration and repair all at the same time as soon as possible. And then after that first opportunity to feed in the dressing room, perhaps after the players have showered and on the way back home, or actually staying on in going to the training ground or going wherever they go for a post-match meal. Some do it together, some are left to do it themselves, but you know, then's a time to take on plenty of carbohydrate and some protein and some fluids for exactly the same purpose, you know, restore. And then on the day after the match, you want to continue with that high carbohydrate intake, because now you're trying to promote the restoration of those carbohydrate stores, the glycogen stores in the muscle, as quickly as possible. And also regular intake of protein, and generally quite a high protein intake is required for players, 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram body mass per day. So it's quite a lot of protein, but that's recommended for the purposes of training adaptation and repair. And just drink fluids after that time according to thirst. Now, if you've got a match coming up, not next week, a week away, but perhaps only 3 days away, then I'd recommend taking creatine. And if you consume 5 grams of creatine with a high carbohydrate intake with your post-match meal, and you carry on with that to provide you with up to 20 grams of creatine over the following 24 hours after the match, you can actually increase your muscle glycogen resynthesis by about 80% in the first 24 hours after exercise. And not a lot of people know that, probably because you don't find it very often in the nutrition books in a minute, but let's just focus on this, getting the carbohydrate in first. You want to get plenty of carbohydrate in within that first 2 hours of exercise, 50 to 150 grams. So 50 grams of carbohydrate you'll find in 200 grams of cooked pasta, 80 grams of raisins, 700 milliliters of a sports drink, or 100 grams of bread, just to give you some examples. Taking extra protein, if you have enough carbohydrate, won't further boost your glycogen resynthesis. You're not taking on protein board for that purpose. So you want an immediate fueling option post-exercise, followed by this high carbohydrate intake together with creatine supplementation in 4 5-gram doses over the following 24 hours when you have your carbohydrates. So you have your creatine with the meals. and aiming for an overall carbohydrate intake of 6 to 8 grams per kilogram body mass per day. The timing can be important as well. If you delay your carbohydrate intake by 2 hours, you don't take it on board until 120 minutes after exercise, you won't get the same rate of glycogen resynthesis in those first few hours after exercise. It's always highest immediately after exercise and declines progressively after that, no matter how much carbohydrate you provide. So take advantage of that early window for glycogen resynthesis by feeding carbohydrate immediately post-exercise. This is where the creatine thing comes in, for a paper published in 2016. So again, not widely known about, I don't think, in the literature. And this is what the effect you get. Taking 20 grams of creatine per day, every day in this 6-day study, you get a glycogen boost to your resynthesis in the first 24 hours only after finishing exhausting exercise. And you can see in this situation, it produced an 82% increase in glycogen resynthesis in that first 24 hours. And nothing further after that. That difference is maintained after 3 and 6 days, but it doesn't get any bigger than that. So all of the effect comes in that first 24 hours. So again, take advantage of that, particularly if you've got a gain coming up in just a few days' time. We do emphasize the intake of protein in post-exercise meals, not necessarily to do with glycogen resynthesis, as I said, but it will increase glycogen resynthesis if your carbohydrate intake isn't as high as it should be, if it's suboptimal, in other words. But the main reasons we take on protein in the post-exercise meals is to increase muscle tissue protein gain and repair, to improve adaptation and repair of the muscles. And it can also, perhaps because of that reason, help to delay or reduce some of the sensations of muscle soreness that players may feel, particularly the day after a match. And there's some evidence it can also help to restore some aspects of immune function, which might be depressed after a stressful game, both physically and psychologically. Lots of supplements, well, maybe not lots, but certainly some supplements are used regularly by footballers. These are some of the more common ones. Creatine I've already mentioned, which can also be used for other reasons. Concentrated beetroot juice because of the nitrate it contains. Caffeine we've already mentioned. Protein supplements, some like to use those in things like shakes if they're making themselves. You've got various forms of carbohydrate, and you've got this caffeine in the form of gum as well, and beta alanine, which is used to increase the concentration of carnosine, a buffer in the muscles, which helps to nullify the acidity. Not something you'd take as a sort of a pre-match thing, but needs to be taken over the longer term. But in the UEFA statement, we said quite categorically that it should always be a food first policy whenever possible. And although there can be benefits in using certain supplements, that should be limited to the ones that you know work, or at least probably work in football, and to use only batch tested supplements to avoid the risk of positive drug tests due to contamination. And always there are risks with taking supplements, and the overall advice is always to seek expert advice from an expert nutritionist and generally ignore all the claims that you see on the internet. We move on to training. Well, lots of things, different activities in training. Energy expenditure can be similar in total to match day, but it depends on what's being done in the training, how long the training session lasts for, how intense it is, what the goals of the training were. But these are typical average values for a high intensity training day, usually a little less intense than in match play, and not as much distance covered in training sessions. And this is the general recommendations for energy intakes and the intakes of macronutrients and also micronutrients, particularly the ones that players might be at risk of being deficient of. Main ones of concern would be vitamin D, iron, and calcium. And certainly for vitamin D, it's probably one of the ones where you probably do need to be taking a supplement, or certainly a supplement would be recommended in the autumn and winter months, because we get most of our vitamin D from sunlight, and often you find players are insufficient or actually frankly deficient of vitamin D once you get into the middle of winter. So if you take 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 per day, from say the beginning of October until the end of March, you will be absolutely sure that none of your players are getting deficient or even inadequate in their vitamin D status. Body composition. This guy here, Nick Broad, sadly died in a car crash back in 2013 at the age of 38. He's actually one of the best ever applied sport nutritionists I've ever met. And he's given me lots of good quotes. I spoke to him lots and worked with him lots during his time at Chelsea, and he finished his career at PSG with Carlo Ancelotti. I don't think it was him, but one of the managers he worked with during his career said to him, your role is to make sure there are no fat bastards in my team. Well, Arsene Wenger said something about body composition as well, if you recall from earlier in the talk. It wasn't quite put in those terms, but you can see that body composition is important in the mind of many managers. But at the end of the day, there is really no single body mass or percentage body fat value that fits all players. So maybe they shouldn't be that concerned. We all have a minimum amount of healthy, essential body fat that we have to have in our body to stay healthy. And typical body fat in professional male players is 7 to 15%, and about 13 to 20% in women. If you do need to lose weight, it's best to do it by cutting down both carbohydrate and fat to a degree, and to cut down your calories, but maintain your normal protein intake. And body composition can be monitored very occasionally, perhaps once or twice a year, using DEXA. It involves radiations, that's why it's not used too much. And more usually you'll use things like skin fold thickness, if you've got somebody trained in the technique to do that reliably, or simply measure body weight, body mass, and percentage body fat can be estimated with bioelectrical impedance in a simple enough way, using those electronic scales you can buy from the chemist, and that can be okay for just monitoring players on a weekly basis or so. But we shouldn't be too concerned, unless, of course, the concern is that players are actually losing weight and not obviously having enough energy in their diet. And then you can get into this syndrome called relative energy deficiency in sport, which used to be referred to as the female athlete triad, but it can affect males as well as females. So it involves weight loss, fatigue, poor sleep, and actually increased risk of bone fractures and more frequent infections and general injuries. So it needs to be avoided. And that means checking on body weight on a fairly regular basis, say once a week for players, and checking that they are actually staying fairly weight stable. One concern could be people who are coming to from school and academies after a full day at school. They're coming for evening training. They've maybe not had much opportunity to eat during the day. So giving them some nutrition on arrival at the training ground can be one way of trying to avoid this problem developing in the youngsters. Let's move on now to the needs of the amateur player. Here we're talking about really training in the evening. Overall, the nutrition requirements can be said to be quite similar to the professional players. Possibly daily energy intake will be a bit less depending on the occupation of the individual. Often people have to do a day's work and then go to training. And that can be the issue. Again, perhaps they're not getting enough energy or carbohydrate on board before they're going to training. And it's not a good idea to do a full days of work and then have your main meal like just an hour or two before you're going to a training session. So the recommendation would be really get your carbohydrate and your protein on board with a good breakfast and a good lunch while you're at work. And then, when you finish work, all you need really is a little carbohydrate snack, a cereal bar or a sandwich or something that you can have on your way to training. Keep well hydrated during the day. Take a sport drink or a carb gel with you that you consume during the training session. And then when you come home, probably after 10 p.m. in the evening, you're tired, you've probably got to go to work the next day. Have a pre-prepared meal ready for you to eat. If you're living on your own, you've got to do that yourself. So have a ready meal like a spaghetti bolognese or something you can stick in the microwave, or if you've got a nice partner, ask them to do a meal for you to consume when you come back home. Again, relatively high carb and some protein in there. For match day performance in amateur football, we're talking often about a 10 o'clock in the morning kickoff on a Sunday. And basically you can follow pretty much exactly what the professional players do. That carbohydrate intake the day before is just as important. And again, you can do what the pros do just before the game, just before kickoff, at half time, at breaks in play, and then the post-match meal. So by and large, things are pretty much the same, except bear in mind, if we move on to the next slide, that for a 10 o'clock kickoff, your pre-match meal is just going to be breakfast. So think about what you have for breakfast on that day. Again, it wants to be high carbohydrate, a little bit of protein, and plenty of fluid, and take your beetroot juice or rhubarb juice if you want at that time. If you want to take on board caffeine, you don't have to take the pills or the potions. You can have a strong cup of coffee about an hour before kickoff. Take that 30-gram gel or some sports drink just before you go on the pitch. And again, then the things again follow pretty much what you would do, what are advised to be done for the professional players. If you're wondering what to have for breakfast, well, cereal could be okay, but you want to generally avoid high fiber stuff. So something, if you're not into rice or pasta for your breakfast, you could just have something like white bread toasted with honey and jam, have a little bit of a pot of fruit with that, and wash it down with a fruit juice. Most of those are about 10% carbohydrates. So if you have half a litre of that for your fluid, you're getting on board about 150 grams of carbohydrate in total with that. Finally, I'm nearly done. The thing we have to consider is personalization of nutrition. We're all different people, individuals. We've got different genetics, boys, girls. We've got people of different ages, different sizes, body mass, different levels of fitness. People sweat at different rates. The metabolism may be a little different. We all have different preferences and tolerances to different foods. And when it comes to playing position in football, obviously goalkeepers are different to central defenders, and they're difficult to the attacking players or the attacking fullbacks. So it's all different. So we have to personalize nutrition as much as possible to the needs of the individual and to the purpose of what the nutrition is being aimed at. Is it used to boost training adaptation, to boost match day performance, to boost recovery, to gain muscle or lose body fat? Or is it during rehabilitation from injury or illness? All of these things affect the nutrition you need to take on board and taken into consideration. So when anybody asks me what's the ideal for football then, well, there isn't one, because it depends on your goals. Are you looking to alter body composition, improve recovery, your health, or overall, ultimately, performance? And if you can, get your good nutritional advice on the latest scientific evidence. The best person to go for that is a well-qualified, up-to-date nutritionist or dietitian. And that advice you get should be personalized to your own needs and your own goals and your own preferences. So essentially, one size does not fit all in the real world of football. No time really to go into this. Lots of different meals can be prepared from the various macronutrient ingredients and the amounts that you want for each type of meal. And if you want more detail on this and lots more on recipes and how to make some of these things, then you'll find them all in that book. That's one thing you don't find in the scientific papers, actually, details of what meals actually contain, how they're made, how you should actually cook them to maintain the best nutrition in them, and get them exactly right. So that's why you need something like a good book, as well as a few science papers to read to make your choices. And finally, lots of things influence the potential nutrition choices of a player. Certainly in the professional game, they get inputs from lots of different sources, some of which are included here. But at the end of the day, I say players should really get their nutrition advice mostly from the club nutritionist or dietitian. And those people will be working in concert with the doctors, the sports scientists, and the chefs now that increasingly work both in the training ground canteens or restaurants, and also in the homes of the players themselves. Many of them actually employ now their own chefs to cook their own food at home when they're away from the ground. So I'll finish on this one. This is the actual look at the book. It's not quite going to be the same cover as that, but it'll be something very similar to that. The final version is being just put together. That's sort of a mock-up of what it will probably look like. And I was lucky enough to get Brendan and Rogers on board to write the foreword to the book. And I've got a couple of really top-class performance chefs helping me, who've helped to put together most of the recipes that are in the book. I'm not a performance chef myself, as you probably know. I'm a scientist and nutritionist who has a love of football. So that's what you'll find in the book. And well, now I'll hand over to Ian. Thank you for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Mike. I was expecting to see your Leicester City shirt on this evening.
Oh, well, I actually got my Barcelona one on tonight because I thought it was a little bit more neutral. I mean, everybody likes Barcelona, don't they? At least the style of football they play.
Excellent. Right, so you get more than one team.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to take a minute to tell you about the conference. The animation hasn't worked on this, so the sort of under. Actually, just click one back, Mike, see if it clears that animation.
I don't think it will actually, Ian, because I think I just took a photo of this and put it on because it was a different format. Yeah.
So yeah, underneath you've got basically the conference. We're doing a half-day conference from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock UK time on the 18th of June, which is 2 weeks on Friday. And it's basically a kind of mini fast-paced conference. Each presenter has half an hour with 10-minute Q&A time. And what you see in front of you is the lineup. So we've tried to get a good mix of different inputs. It's very practitioner focused. So most people, actually everyone there works with actual clients. And we're trying to keep it as practical as possible. It's the first time us at CISN have put together a conference. We're keeping the price nice and low to try and attract new people. So please come and join if you're available. It's £25, but we are offering the early bird, which ended at the end of May, to be extended another day. So at the end of day tomorrow, midnight Thursday, we will extend that early bird of £20 for you. So very cheap for a high level conference. Mike, next slide, please. These are our details. And the next slide. And we're over to Q&A. So Mike, I think you could stop your screen share. I've got a big pile of questions that have come through. Great. So I'm going to offer everyone to either unmute and ask the question yourself, or if I get a pause of a few seconds, I'll just ask it myself, okay? So first question from Callum. Oh, Callum Foster, we had the rebound hypoglycemia question, so I think that was answered okay. Paula Wren, do you want to come and ask your question about positions and nutrient requirements?
Yeah, hi, Ian. I think it was actually answered on one of the slides. The question was, will the stats and the nutritional requirements vary in between players' positions? And I think that was actually referred to in one of the slides. So presumably what we were looking at there was a sort of mean, but as we went on, then Mike actually went through and did explain about the personalised nature. And certainly some of the players that I've seen at West Ham are an awful lot lazier than some of the others. So if you've got your regular box-to-box midfielder, then he's really going to put a shift in during the game, whereas some of the strikers, let's say, are not quite as industrious. But yeah. As I say, certainly, Mike, that was covered in exactly what I thought. Then it all comes down to the personalised nature, doesn't it? And obviously,
yeah, and the energy needs can be estimated from the distance you see players are covering, and the relative intensity of the activity from all the GPS data that are generated nowadays. That informs the actual energy requirements of the players. Yeah, so the guys who are doing the more work obviously need to eat a bit more. But you also have to take in things like the body size as well, because a bigger player will need more energy. In general.
Yeah, and obviously the outlier to all of that will be the goalkeepers, who normally have their own training regimes anyway, don't they? But
yeah, they will often do a sort of a slightly longer warm-up sometimes than the outfield players before the start of a game. But overall, the measurements that have been made generally indicate the energy requirements of the goalkeepers on match day are something like about 500 or 600 calories less than the average outfield player.
Yeah, there was another slide that you put up, Mike, which interested me, because a friend of mine is a performance chef who works with a lot of Premier League footballers, and he's mentioned to me on a number of occasions there is quite a lot of conflicts in between the various inputs that actually come in. The actual club dietitian may be singing a completely different tune to what he may be saying, and the S&C coach may be something else. It's not unusual for interesting conversations to take place, let's put it like that.
Yeah, well, the conversations really should take place between the performance chef, whoever's responsible for the player's nutrition, usually a nutritionist or dietitian. They're the ones who should be dictating what the amount of carbohydrate, the amount of protein should be. The performance chef should be formulating meals to produce those amounts in a nice, tasty, nutritious, attractive meal, and often that should involve interacting with the player as well. So it's it should be a three-way conversation, because all players have different tastes, preferences. You've got people from Africa, from European countries, from the Middle East nowadays playing in the Premier League. And a performance chef's got to be able to cater for all those different tastes and religious issues that come into it. So it's a very complicated picture nowadays, but if you have that three-way conversation, and most of the people I know who work in football do that. It's a sports scientist or nutritionist together with speaking on the phone with the performance chef and the player, three-way conversation to get exactly the right nutrition in exactly the right form that the player wants. Because if you don't feed the player what he wants, he might not eat what's on the plate. So, I mean, at the end of the day, you want to empty the plate. That's the whole idea.
Yeah, very much so. And I think as well, obviously you're going to have various vegetarian options, and God forbid you might even have some vegans out there as well, which is just going to confuse matters mightily.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Okay, Stacey Holland, are you around? Do you want to ask about gut issues? She said her internet wasn't great. So, Mike, she said, what about professional footballers with gut issues and dysbiosis in terms of what you'd recommend for their eating patterns?
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, again, it's personalization of the nutrition. It depends on what, foods that particular player can tolerate, and also perhaps the timing of the nutrition. So if it's a 3 o'clock kickoff, might be better to have a larger meal at breakfast time, and maybe not so much in the pre-match meal. Some players don't actually like to eat very much in that few hours. Well, we're talking sort of 3 to 4 hours before kickoff, but even so, some will prefer to have a good breakfast. I know Ilkay Gundogan at Manchester City, I've heard, is of this ilk. He likes a good breakfast. He'll get his protein, his carbs, his fluid in then, and then he'll just have, I think he says a bit of banana cake and a nice coffee for his, his pre-match meal. So he's still getting a little bit of carb in. And Tom Perry, the nutritionist, I know, always likes to get the players to take on board around 30. He's happy if he can get 30 grams of carbohydrate into them just before they go on the pitch. So there's different ways of dealing with it. You've got an issue if people have a problem with consuming carbohydrate, that is going to be an issue for any footballer. But if they can take it in the right form, and it might just mean having more refined stuff, and certainly avoiding high fiber foods. You don't want stuff sitting in the stomach when the player goes out onto the pitch, unless it's a bit of fluid and a bit of carbohydrate dissolved in there. That's all you want. Otherwise their stomach should be completely empty, so digestive issues shouldn't be an issue.
Thank you. Okay, Stephen Harvey, do you want to, you've got 2 questions there. Do you want to jump on?
Yeah, I'll just unmute so that I don't get a funny video. I was just asking if you had any concerns with the amount of sugar that athletes might take on board, and whether, I know that's been a bit of an issue with some ultra athletes where it can cause potential for diabetes and things like that. So I didn't know if that was ever of a concern with anyone, but I guess that might be monitored by regular checkups by doctors and things like that.
Well, it will, but I don't think taking on board a certain amount of the carbohydrate in the form of free sugars, like what, for example, you will find, for example, in fruit juices, should be a concern at all. I've never heard of any current Premier League or professional football player who suffered from type 2 diabetes. They can get it more likely when they retire, but then they sometimes carry on eating similar amounts to what they were doing when they were playing, and they're not expending the same amount of activity. So they put on weight, and putting on extra weight, and particularly visceral fat around the gut, is the main thing that drives you towards type 2 diabetes.
So it's just a case of like natural sugars, particularly, and then burning them off while you're playing. And I guess it could be a problem for a recreational player if they're stepping aside and moving into amateur game and not expending the same amount of energy, right?
It is.
But go on.
There's no particular issue with the sugar in itself. The issue is, consuming too much energy in any form, more than you need. That's what makes you put on weight. And it's that accumulation of body fat that drives the inflammation that takes you to the condition of type 2 diabetes, not just consuming excess, free sugars.
Yeah, I mean, it's just some questions that people have asked me, so I want to give them the right information. So I appreciate that. And then I think so. We kind of covered this in the last comment, but suggestions you had for those who have different dietary preferences. I mean, you mentioned about having, then went on to talk about personalized plans and things like that. But obviously, if you've got a team of athletes, you know, it's and you're kind of a solitary coach, then it's a matter of just advising that they go and see a registered nutrition, right? Is that what you would advise? Say if you're in like a semi-professional team or something like that.
To a degree, it's a good idea if they can consult with a professional nutrition, because they're always going to get hopefully the right advice that way. But you can give some of these more sort of general principles. You know, people will generally eat to satisfy their appetite, particularly if they take their time over eating their food and not gulping it down, and provided they're not drinking, you know, alcohol along with it, which provides extra energy that's really of no use to the body, it'll just go to body fat, then there shouldn't really be an issue. So if they follow the general guidelines, like the information you'll find in these papers or what I've put in the book, I think that'll give them a good guide as to what, you know, the average professional player is doing. The average professional player in the male game weighs 75 kilos. And a lot of the guidelines are actually given not in absolute amounts, but in, you know, grams per kilogram body mass. So if you know your body weight, you can work out how much you as an individual should be having for, you know, pre-match meals, for post-match recovery meals, and on training days.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Sorry if I sound a bit ignorant, but obviously I was here to learn, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Stephen. Amy Campbell, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much for that, Mike. That was awesome. My question is just, is there anything specific that you sort of implement during pre-season in terms of nutrition strategies for whether it be a pro team or amateur players, or is it just sort of dependent on the schedule and things like that?
Well, I don't actually implement anything. I provide some occasional consultancy when asked by the people at Leicester City. I've done something similar for other clubs as well. But for pre-season, obviously that's when the players have come back from, you know, usually a holiday, occasionally involvement in some European competition, national competition. But they've all really come back and having had a bit of a rest, a bit of a break, and been away from the club. They may have been given some guidelines on how to train and what to eat while they're away, but you can never be sure exactly how closely they followed that. So first thing you do when they come back is, you know, body composition measurements, some usual fitness tests at the first week of pre-season. You get an idea of where people are. Some might be a little bit overweight. They're probably not likely to be underweight, but one or two might have been putting on a few extra kilos. So you might want, but they are going to be doing an increased, you know, volume and intensity of training in those first 4 or 5 weeks of pre-season training. So that's an opportunity to burn it off and, you know, feed them a little bit less. Again, maintain the protein because you don't want to alter their training adaptation, susceptibility to injury, etc. But you can cut down a little bit on the fat and the carbs if they are overweight, and just monitor their weight and their percentage body fat till they get where they want to be, which is usually where they were at the end of last season or somewhere close to that. So those are the main issues I think that are of concern, and then it's just getting ready for the start of the season. But you know, you've got time, usually 4, 5, 6 weeks, to correct issues. Often blood samples will be taken as well when the players come back to see where they are in terms of you can measure the, you know, micronutrient status of things like vitamin D and iron, etc. And then, you know, corrective nutrition can be implemented then, often without the need for supplements.
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. Adam Lloyd, do you want to jump on and ask your question?
Hi there. Hi, Mike. Thanks very much. It was brilliant. Really enjoyed it. My question was around particularly academy footballers, so under 9s all the way up to, you know, under 18, say. I know that's a really big age scale, but just wondering if the same type of recovery and muscle glycogen or glycogen use is applicable to youth athletes. I read some studies around muscle damage saying that the force exerted on the muscles wasn't as great as adult athletes, and therefore there wasn't such a need for such a focused recovery approach in younger athletes. I just wondered around sort of carbohydrates and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And probably the main issue is that there has been a lot of research on the younger athletes compared to the adults. And part of that's for ethical reasons of involving these kids in those sorts of studies where you're driving to the level of doing muscle damage or things to them, or their propensity to getting that. So there are issues there that we can't really do much about, sort of to test scientifically. The general advice, I think, is similar to nutrition in terms of what there are some specific differences for adolescents athletes in terms of their micronutrient requirements, for example, and I cover some of those in the book as well. I just didn't have time to go into the junior player, or particularly the female player. Apologies to the ladies for that. In the time I had available in this talk, but I have covered all of that in the book, so that's something to look out for. I think the main issue I've heard of, the main issue of concern with the junior players is this issue of them. They do their training in the evenings, usually midweek. They've done a full day at school. Some of them might even had a PE lesson during that time. You've no control over that yourselves, and they come. They might not have had a very good breakfast. They might have not hardly have anything for lunch, and they're coming to you, and you want them to do a couple of hours of hard training. And I know at one club, I shouldn't name specifics, but it's an English Premier League club. I know they had an issue with a lot of their young players seem to get a higher incidence of fractures, like shin splints and the like, than was expected, or higher than what they were getting with the pros even. So they decided that was possibly an issue to do with inadequate energy and protein intake. And what the nutritionists at the club implemented there was when the young kids arrived at the ground, usually brought there by their parents, early evening, asked them what they had. Most of them say, well, I've just had a sandwich or something on the way there, not had time to go home and have a proper meal or anything. And you probably wouldn't want to have a full meal before you get there. But they came up with the idea, well, let's give them a nice, good, high carb, high protein, sort of milkshake type thing, 1,000 calories to make up the deficit they estimated they probably had on those training days. And they just got them to gulp that down before they actually started the training session. He's given some fluid in there as well, and that did seem to actually solve the issue. So energy intake is something you kind of think of that last almost. Let's get the carbs in, get how much protein do we need, what micronutrients we need. And you tend to slowly lose sight of the energy sometimes, and in some cases, I think particularly for the young players and possibly also for female players, that can be an important issue. I listened to a podcast, was it a webinar thing, a podcast thing it was. There was an interview with Jordan Nobbs, the England female forward, and she said the most important thing she'd learned since taking on board information from a top class nutritionist was that she should eat more. And now she says 70% of my focus is on what I eat and 30% on how I train. So that tells you, energy is important.
That's brilliant, Mike. Thanks for that. Great insight. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Good question. Yeah, sometimes it's the most basic things that can have the biggest effect. Mike, there was only one more question, and that was your creatine study. If somebody looking for the citation, can I get that from you by email and we can share it out with everyone tomorrow?
Yeah, I can. I've got a PDF of the paper. I can send you that in if you want to send it out to people or make it available. Fab. Yeah, sure, no problem. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Mike. It's been a pleasure having you again. And we wish you all the luck with your new book.
Thank you.
So everyone on this call must go out and buy the book. And yeah, so yeah, enjoy your retirement. Don't work too hard.
No, I try not to. That'll be my last book for a while, I think.
Yeah, you have to enjoy your tennis.
Yeah.
All right, so guys, thank you so much for joining. We're doing this every first Wednesday of every month. So next month it's my shot. I'm going to do a presentation on cardiovascular health and how much is the right amount and how to support the cardiovascular system through nutrition. So we hope you can join us then. And of course, we've got the conference before then. So if you can, please join us then too. Okay, so with that, good night and
okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.